Let's kick off with a slightly odd fact check that you've had to do because it concerns a kiwi fruit testing positive for COVID. I can't believe I'm saying this, but a rapid COVID
Yeah.
19 tests are unreliable, the claim was, because fruit and Coca Cola can give positive results. My guess is that this is not exactly what these tests were designed to do.
Yeah, I think before anyone starts panicking and worrying about catching COVID from their fruit bowl, I need to come right in and say no, the kiwi fruit did not test positive for COVID. Although underlying it is an interesting anomaly, if you like, in how tests can be misused to make it look that way. Yeah, this actually originates in a video from Italy where a group of scientists, as part of a long video posted by someone, I must say, who has a long-standing interest in conspiracy theories, let's say, and the video contains this very systematic seeming process where they test a whole series of different fruits and vegetables using a rapid COVID test. Those are the lateral flow tests to see if they can get any positive results, and they do indeed. Kiwi fruit, orange, and fruits of the forest juice all managed to test positive, or it seems to test positive, but of course that's not really what's going on.
Okay. Seeing as I'm hoping that most people will dismiss anything like that, but let's touch upon another thing that you've looked into, which directly relates to what we've been talking about. You have been looking into the accuracy of the PCR tests, the lateral flow tests, and the antibody tests. Which is the most accurate, and what are the facts behind claims that they can be inaccurate?
Yeah, I mean that in a way that underlies this story about the kiwi fruit, and we saw a similar thing with a glass of Coca-Cola, which was apparently gave a positive result in the Austrian Parliament when an MP there used it. And really, what this is about is, I think, a concern that many people have, that if the testing is inaccurate, then it could be skewing our entire response to the virus. You know, if we think that there are many more people or many fewer people with the disease than is reality, then it could make a real mess of everything we're trying to do to stop it. So the accuracy of these tests, it is quite a technical matter, but it is enormously important for all of our lives. And in the case of the kiwi fruit, the issue was, and probably the Coca-Cola too, that the acidity of these juices effectively breaks the test. It makes a line appear that makes it look like, I'm doing air quotes, although you can't see me, a positive test. But of course, it's not. It's not at all. I actually spoke to a scientist about this who said, well, you know, imagine if you hold a cigarette lighter under your smoke alarm and it goes off, and then say, aha, but there's not really a fire in my house. This smoke alarm isn't reliable. It's kind of a bit like that. You're deliberately misusing the test, and of course you can make it give what appears to be a positive result. In reality, that is not happening with these lateral flow tests. They are not giving positive results from people who aren't positive, who don't have the virus in them, and that's been checked, you know, repeatedly with the ones in the UK that are being used. They go through this validation process, and they give them samples of known positives and see how often they find them, and they're very successful at that. The issue with these tests actually is more on the other side, which is whether or not they pick up all the negatives.
Right.
Sorry, whether they pick up all the positives, I should say. God, it's such a difficult thing to talk about. You go
Well,
backwards and forwards
the
with these
false,
words.
yeah, the false negative. So you could be positive, but the PCR or the lateral flow test may say that you are COVID free, whereas in fact you are COVID positive.
Yes, exactly. So the three you mentioned were PCR tests, lateral flow tests, and antibody tests. We can get the antibody tests out of the way very quickly because they are only used to test whether someone has had the virus, not whether it's actually in their body at the moment. That's a blood test. So that's not very often what's being talked about when you hear discussion of cases and so on in the news. The other two types of tests are tests to see whether you have the virus at the moment. Now, the PCR test is the, if you like, has been the standard test up to now. It's very, very accurate, very good at finding both people who do have the virus and correctly saying people who don't have the virus. It does that very well. But it takes a bit of time. It's quite high tech, quite sophisticated, and the samples need to be processed in a lab. That's why anyone who's listening who's done a COVID test where they had to wait a day or two, or maybe even longer sometimes, to get their result, it's because their test needs to go to a lab and be quickly processed. There's a new kind of test, which are these lateral flow tests, which is much quicker. That's the big advantage of them, really. You can do them in 15 minutes, and they are very good at telling you. Um, if they tell you you've got it, they're almost always right. If they tell you you haven't, they're slightly more often not right. So they might slightly underestimate the number of people who have the virus.
Okay, let's whiz through these next few ones because we're running a little bit short on time, but I think they're important to get through. And of course, as a reminder for people listening, everything Leo and I are talking about, you can find it on the Full Fact website by going to fullfact.org. And indeed, if there's anything else you want to look at concerning the pandemic and other things, just do a quick search. Everything is really easy to find. Let's look at this claim by Dr. Liam Fox, the Conservative MP. He claimed that from the 73,444 deaths registered in 2020 in England and Wales, he was questioning whether or not they were all COVID-19 as the primary cause of death. So he said that we don't have data on people who died of COVID-19 as a primary infection. You've looked into this. What have you found?
Yeah, this is another common concern. We hear this quite a lot. People send us messages on WhatsApp and through other means saying, how do we know that these people that I read about who have died of COVID really died of COVID? They sometimes ask, did they die with COVID? And the classic example that's sometimes mentioned is someone tests positive for COVID, but it doesn't make them very ill, and then they get run over a few days later. Would that show up as a COVID death? Might we be overestimating the number of people who the disease is really killing? And that's, I think, part of what Liam Fox was getting at. He said, it's quite a sort of a long speech, so I won't give you all of it, but essentially he said that the data we have at the moment, in his words, does not tell us what we really need to know, who actually died of COVID as the primary infection and various other things. But yeah, as we pointed out in our fact check, actually, this is an unusual case of where we do actually know something. We do have data on how many people died with COVID as the underlying cause. So that comes from death certificates. That's really the best source of information for COVID death. So when somebody dies for any reason, a doctor or sometimes a coroner will complete a death certificate explaining what they died from. The reality, of course, of what causes someone's death can be very complicated. Someone might have a long-term health condition which makes them more likely to develop another problem, and maybe that problem just weakens them before something else comes along. So it really takes a doctor's opinion in a case-by-case basis on what ultimately really was the short-term cause of someone's death. And that is the underlying death number that we have for COVID. We do know that in 2020, 73,444 people in England and Wales died of COVID. So actually the numbers you read don't overestimate it very much at all, I'm afraid.
Let's do the last one in 45 seconds, which is coronavirus rates amongst teachers are 333% above the average. I'm very suspicious of the 333%. Just seems too convenient, Leo. Go on, you've looked at this. What have you found?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very unreliable number. I mean, if anyone's wondering, 333% above means 4 times as much. It is data that was sourced by a teachers' union from 3 different local councils, and one of the groups of teachers that were looked at, the secondary school teachers in Leeds, said that they had COVID about 4 times as often as the average in that area were testing positive for COVID. The problem is that, of course, that's only one group of teachers. It's not all teachers generally. It was only at a specific time last autumn, overlapping with half term and with the lockdown. And there are other problems too, which is that these were teachers saying they had the disease, but not actually necessarily testing positive from it, which is different from the local data for cases that they were comparing them with. And as you'll see in our fact check, if anyone's interested, many other reasons as well. Essentially, we care a lot about whether teachers are at higher risk of catching COVID. They may be more exposed, particularly when schools are open and everything else is closed. But at the moment, there's a lot of contradictory evidence. There really isn't, I don't think, any very strong evidence telling us one way or another. And this particular claim that they're 4 times as likely, I think, is not reliable and shouldn't be trusted.
Leo, thank you as always. Leo Benedictus, one of the fact checkers at the fact checking charity Full Fact. Of course, as mentioned earlier, you can find all the fact checks that I spoke with Leo by going to fullfact.org.